I was the one who signed the order. I need you to understand that before anything else. When the galaxy finally cracked open, and every species scrambled to pick a side, my name was the one sitting at the bottom of Resolution 7701. I was the senior diplomatic archivist of the Galactic Council, a title that sounds powerful, until you realize it mostly means you file paperwork while empires rise and crumble around your desk. My name is Valith Serene. I am 412 years old, by your counting, and I am writing this account because someone needs to record what actually happened with Earth before the propagandists and the revisionists twist it into something comfortable enough to swallow. 40 years ago, our deep space detection grid flagged a small blue planet in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. Third rock from a yellow dwarf star, liquid water on its surface, a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere buzzing with electromagnetic noise, and radio signals. Not a few cautious whispers like most emerging civilizations produce. Billions of them. The species living on that world called themselves humans, and they were the loudest thing our sensors had ever recorded. They broadcast everything: music, political arguments, declarations of war, love stories, mathematical proofs, cooking instructions, children's entertainment, emergency frequencies crackling with disasters. It was as if someone had walked into a dark, quiet room and turned on every light and every speaker at the same time. The detection grid nearly overloaded trying to catalog it all. 3 analysts had to be reassigned just to process the backlog. Standard procedure for a new discovery was simple. We had performed it 311 times before, across 10,000 years of galactic governance. You identify the new civilization, you compile a first contact package, you transmit it on frequencies the target species can receive, and you wait. The transmission explains the Galactic Council, the Accord of Mutual Compliance, and the terms of integration. It is polite but firm. It says, in essence, welcome to the neighborhood, here are the rules, and we look forward to your cooperation. Every species responds. Some respond with joy, overwhelmed by the discovery that they are not alone. Some respond with terror, convinced that the transmission is the opening move of an invasion. A few respond with threats they quickly abandon once they see the size of our fleet registry and understand exactly how outmatched they are. But they all respond, every single one. In 10,000 years of galactic history, 311 species discovered, 311 responses received. Most within hours. The longest silence on record belonged to the Velothi, a deeply spiritual species that spent 11 days in ritual meditation before composing their reply. 11 days was considered an extraordinary delay. Earth was species 312, and Earth said nothing. We sent the first contact transmission on a frequency we knew they could receive. We encoded it in mathematical patterns any sufficiently advanced civilization could decode. We included visual representations, audio greetings in synthesized approximations of their most common languages, and a detailed star map showing Earth's position relative to Council space. We transmitted it 3 times over a period of 48 hours, just to be certain. Then we waited. A day passed, a week, a month. Our intelligence division, the largest and most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in the galaxy, intercepted human communications that proved beyond any shadow of doubt that they had received the transmission. They had decoded it within 72 hours. They had translated it into at least 14 of their languages. They had distributed it to their major governments through secure channels. Their scientists had verified the star map. Their linguists had analyzed the audio greetings. Their mathematicians had confirmed the encoding was genuine and not a natural phenomenon. They understood every word we had said. They simply chose not to answer. I spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing the intelligence intercepts after that confirmation came through. I sat in my office surrounded by holographic displays showing human broadcast traffic, and I tried to understand what kind of species looks at an invitation from the stars and decides to pretend it never arrived. The answer, I discovered, was buried in their history. Humans had a concept they called the Trojan horse. Thousands of years before they had electricity or combustion engines, one group of humans had presented a gift to another, a massive wooden structure shaped like an animal, and the recipients had pulled it inside their fortified city with celebration and relief, believing the war was over. Inside the structure were soldiers. The city burned that night. The story might have been myth, but the lesson it carried was treated as absolute truth by virtually every human culture that encountered it. Do not trust gifts from strangers. Do not open the door just because someone knocks. And above all, do not assume that a friendly message means friendly intentions. Our first contact transmission, I realized with a slow dawning horror, looked exactly like a Trojan horse to a species that had invented the concept. A beautiful offering from an unknown civilization, promising everything a young species could dream of, arriving unsolicited from the darkness of space. Of course they did not answer. Their entire evolutionary history had taught them that the thing that looks too good to be true is the thing most likely to destroy you. I tried to explain this to my colleagues. They smiled politely and told me I was overthinking a simple problem with a simple solution. The humans would come around. They always did. The first emergency session the council held about Earth's silence drew every delegate in the building. 3,000 representatives from 312 species packed into the grand curved chamber, and every single one of them was confused. I had been in politics long enough to know that confusion is the most dangerous state a governing body can occupy. Confused leaders do not pause and think. They reach for the nearest weapon, because aggression feels like certainty when nothing else does. The Draythari ambassador spoke first, as he always did. His name was Kale Vorath, and he was everything wrong with the Galactic Council, wrapped in scaled skin and diplomatic robes. The Draythari hegemony was the largest military power in the galaxy. They had not joined the Council out of any desire for cooperation. They had joined because they understood, with the cold clarity of born conquerors, that it was easier to control an institution from the inside than to fight it from the outside. Their fleet was twice the size of the next 3 species combined. Their intelligence network rivaled the Council's own, and Kale Vorath, their ambassador for the past century, had turned political manipulation into a performing art. He stood at his podium, his black eyes sweeping the chamber with the practiced calm of a predator surveying a field, and he called humanity a defective species. He said their silence was evidence of cognitive limitation. He said they were clearly too primitive to understand the significance of what they had received, and recommended that we classify them as a feral world and redirect our resources to more productive matters. I voted against that classification, not because I harbored any great affection for a species I had never met, but because the intelligence data told a very different story than the one Kale was selling. Our analysts had been monitoring human communications for months by that point, and what they found was not a civilization too primitive to understand first contact. What they found was a species that had held global conferences about our transmission, debated its implications at the highest levels of their governments, and then made a collective, deliberate decision to say nothing. That distinction mattered enormously. A species that cannot respond is harmless. A species that chooses not to respond is something else entirely, and the difference between those two things should have kept every delegate in that chamber awake at night. But my objection was noted and filed and promptly ignored, as most of my objections were. The Council voted to classify Earth as a pre-integration observation target. We would watch, we would study, we would wait for the humans to come to their senses and respond like every other species before them. 5 years passed. Earth said nothing. 10 years. Nothing. The Council sent a second transmission, more detailed and more inviting than the first. This one emphasized the benefits of integration, access to galactic trade networks that spanned 9 arms of the galaxy, medical technologies that could extend human lifespans by centuries, faster-than-light propulsion systems, materials science that would make their most advanced engineering look like children stacking blocks. We offered them everything the galaxy had to give, laid out like a feast before a starving traveler. Earth received the second transmission. Earth decoded it. Earth filed it alongside the first one, and said absolutely nothing. I began to study humans on my own time. I requisitioned access to every piece of intercepted communication our intelligence division had collected, and I spent months reading. Their history first, then their art, their science, their philosophy, their patterns of conflict and cooperation. I read about their wars, their plagues, their revolutions, their astonishing capacity for both cruelty and compassion. I read about a species that had split the atom, walked on its own moon, mapped the code of its own biology, and connected every individual on its planet through an invisible web of instantaneous communication. What struck me most was not their technological achievement, impressive as it was their resilience. They had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times. They had come within minutes of global nuclear annihilation on at least 2 occasions documented in their own histories. They had survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, pandemic diseases that killed 1/3 of their population, and wars so vast and so devastating that they had invented entirely new words to describe the scale of the suffering. And after each catastrophe, they had rebuilt. Not slowly, not cautiously. They rebuilt with a ferocious energy that suggested the catastrophe itself was fuel, that being knocked down was not a defeat, but a starting signal. I found a human phrase that appeared in dozens of their cultures in various forms. What does not destroy me makes me stronger. It was not entirely accurate, based on my understanding of human biology, but as a description of their civilizational character, it was perfect. Every disaster they survived made the next generation more prepared, more resourceful, more determined. They were a species that treated near-extinction events as learning opportunities. And I learned something that chilled me in a way I had not experienced in 4 centuries of life. Humans did not trust easily. They had spent their entire evolutionary history surrounded by predators, by competitors, by threats emerging from every direction. Their civilization was built on a foundation of betrayal. Every time one group extended a hand to another, there was a real and documented chance that the hand would hold a weapon. They had been invaded, colonized, enslaved, manipulated, and lied to by each other so many times that suspicion was coded into their cultural identity. They had a saying I found in dozens of their languages, expressed in different words but always carrying the same meaning: trust but verify. And even that, I suspected, overstated their willingness to trust. A species forged in that kind of relentless competition does not stay silent because it is stupid or afraid. It stays silent because it is watching, learning, cataloging every piece of information it can gather before it makes its first move. I wrote a report. I submitted it through formal channels with every classification marker I could attach to it. I argued that Earth's silence was not defiance or ignorance, but deliberate strategy. I argued that a species with humanity's history would view our transmissions not as an invitation, but as a threat assessment, and that their silence was the sound of 8 billion people collectively deciding to reveal nothing about themselves until they understood exactly what they were dealing with. I recommended extreme caution. I recommended patience. I recommended that the Council resist the political pressure to force a response, and instead, wait for humanity to speak on its own terms, in its own time. My report was read by 14 people. 12 of them wrote dismissive responses. The other 2 did not respond at all. My report was buried in the archive, alongside 1,000 other warnings that nobody wanted to hear. 20 years after the initial transmission, the Council's patience shattered like glass on stone. The Drethari had spent 2 decades building their political case for aggressive action. Kael Voreth was relentless. He delivered speech after speech in the Council chamber about the growing danger of an uncontacted species developing unchecked on the edge of civilized space. He pointed to Earth's accelerating technology. Their space programs were advancing faster than any species we had ever observed. They were constructing orbital stations. They were landing robotic probes on neighboring planets. They were sending research vessels deeper into their own solar system with increasing frequency and increasing capability. And still they would not speak to us. My moderate faction shrank every year. Species that had once argued for patience began to waver under the weight of Drethari rhetoric and their own growing fear. The argument was always the same, repeated in 100 different ways by 100 different delegates. What if the humans are building weapons? What if their silence is the silence before an attack? What if we wait too long and they become too strong to stop? I tried to counter these arguments. I stood at my podium session after session and explained that nothing in the intelligence data suggested hostile intent. I argued that humans were not preparing to attack anyone. They were preparing to defend themselves, And there was a vast difference between those two postures that the council was either too frightened or too proud to acknowledge. Nobody listened. Fear does not listen to reason, and the council chamber had become a cathedral of fear. Resolution 7701 was drafted by the Draythari delegation and co-sponsored by the Ur Compact, a coalition of 6 species that functioned as the Council's unofficial enforcement arm. The resolution gave Earth one standard galactic year to formally acknowledge the Galactic Council and submit to species classification under the Accord of Mutual Compliance. Failure to comply would result in corrective diplomatic measures. The phrase was deliberately vague. Every delegate in that chamber knew it meant military force. Every delegate voted for it anyway, including me. I voted yes because I was tired, and because I was foolish enough to believe that perhaps a deadline would work. Perhaps the humans simply needed a push. I was wrong, and I carry that vote like a scar. The resolution was transmitted on every frequency we had. We attached fleet deployment records, weapons specifications, and a detailed account of what had happened to the last species that refused integration. The Kelvari. The official story said their government was peacefully replaced. The real story was darker. But the council had buried that truth so deep that most delegates believed the sanitized version. Earth received the ultimatum. Our intelligence teams intercepted a recording from a secure military facility. A woman's voice, flat and calm, said to a room full of officers, "If they wanted to talk, they would come to the door. They are watching us from across the street. We do not answer that kind of visitor." The room laughed, genuine laughter, the laughter of people who had already decided exactly what they were going to do and found the whole situation darkly amusing. The galactic year passed. Earth said nothing. We mistook their silence for ignorance. Some of us mistook it for weakness. No one, not a single voice among 312 species, considered that it might be contempt. That was our first mistake. It would not be our last. The council chamber erupted into the most brutal political session I had witnessed in 200 years of service, the moment the deadline expired. Kael Vorith demanded immediate military action. He called humanity a disease that had been allowed to fester. He called their silence an act of war against the galactic order. He called for the immediate deployment of a full Weninger Presto compliance fleet to the Sol system to compel integration by force. I rose to speak against it. I stood at my podium, and I argued for 3 consecutive hours. I cited every piece of evidence I had. I cited intelligence reports showing no hostile activity from Earth. I cited diplomatic precedent for extended negotiation timelines with unusual species. I cited the basic strategic principle that you do not corner an unknown predator in its own territory unless you are absolutely certain you can survive the consequences. The Draythari delegation laughed at me. The Ur Compact delegates shook their heads in condescending pity, and the moderates, the species that had once stood beside me and argued for patience, stared at their hands and said nothing. Silence, it seemed, was contagious. The vote passed with a 70% majority. The Council authorized a trade exclusion perimeter around the Sol system. The official language described it as a diplomatic pressure instrument designed to encourage voluntary compliance. The reality was far simpler. It was a blockade. A ring of 412 automated stations positioned at the outer boundary of the Sol system, each one armed with targeting arrays, communication jammers, and enough firepower to destroy any civilian vessel that attempted to cross the line without authorization. Earth was being caged. I watched the deployment from the observation gallery. The holographic display showed the Sol system in miniature, that yellow star surrounded by its small family of planets, and the blue dot of Earth glowing softly at its heart. One by one, the blockade stations activated, each appearing as a red point of light, slowly forming a sphere of surveillance and threat around the entire system. It took 6 standard days to complete the perimeter. I expected panic from the humans. I expected frantic transmissions, emergency broadcasts, military mobilization, perhaps even a futile attempt to breach the perimeter with whatever primitive spacecraft they possessed. That was the pattern. Every other species that had faced a trade exclusion perimeter had buckled within weeks. The economic isolation alone was devastating. Cut off from galactic trade, Most civilizations experienced rapid social collapse as their populations realized they were trapped. Earth did none of those things. Our surveillance teams reported no significant change in human behavior. Governments did not declare emergencies. Military forces did not mobilize in any observable way. The general population continued their daily routines, as if the most powerful political institution in the galaxy had not just locked them inside their own solar system. The only changes were subtle. Government budgets shifted. Funding that had been directed toward consumer industries quietly redirected to research institutions and infrastructure projects. Universities received enormous increases in their allocations. Manufacturing facilities across the planet began retooling from civilian production to something our analysts could not quite identify. The changes were gradual, methodical, and almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for them. I was looking, and the more I looked, the more frightened I became. Their internet, the global information network that connected every human on the planet, underwent a quiet transformation. Traffic patterns shifted. Enormous volumes of data began moving through encrypted channels that had not existed before the blockade. Our code-breaking teams, some of the finest in the galaxy, attempted to crack the encryption. They failed. Not because the encryption was particularly elegant. It was brute force. Layer upon layer of mathematical complexity, piled so deep that even our quantum processing systems could not find the bottom. The humans were not being clever. They were being thorough. They had buried their secrets under so much noise that digging them out would have taken longer than the remaining lifespan of their sun. Their population's behavior changed in ways that were almost imperceptible. Fitness programs surged in popularity. Engineering and physics courses at their universities saw enrollment triple. A generation of young humans was quietly preparing itself for something, and the civilian cover stories, health trends, educational reform, economic restructuring were so perfectly ordinary that an observer who was not specifically looking for a pattern would have seen nothing at all. But there was a pattern, and it pointed in one direction. Every change, every shift, every subtle reallocation of resources and attention was aimed at making the human species harder to conquer. Not harder to reach, not harder to find, harder to break. Kale Voreth declared the blockade a triumph. He gave a speech, claiming that humanity was clearly intimidated and was preparing its inevitable surrender. He predicted formal capitulation within 3 months. I looked at the same data he was looking at and saw something entirely different. I saw a species that had recognized a siege for exactly what it was and had calmly, quietly, without a single wasted motion, begun preparing for a very long war. 3 months into the blockade, something happened that should have changed everything. A Council science vessel conducting routine patrols near Jupiter detected an anomaly beneath the ice crust of Europa, one of the gas giant's moons. The sensors registered energy signatures of a type and magnitude that should have been flatly impossible for any pre-integration species to produce. The readings were so extraordinary that the vessel's captain ran 3 complete diagnostic cycles on his equipment before accepting them as genuine. The report was classified at the highest level within hours. I only learned about it because of Torek. Torek was a Council intelligence operative, one of the most capable agents in the entire service. He had been stationed at a monitoring post on the outer edge of the Sol system for 6 years, intercepting and analyzing human communications. He was methodical, careful, and famously difficult to rattle. I had worked with him for decades and trusted his judgment completely. When he reached me through a secure channel, I could see his hands trembling, not from cold, from fear. He said the Europa readings were not an isolated event. Over recent months, similar energy signatures had been detected beneath the surface of Titan, inside multiple asteroids in the belt between Mars and Jupiter, and buried deep under the iron-red soil of Mars itself. The signatures were consistent across all locations, indicating a coordinated construction program of enormous scale. I asked him what the humans were building. He was silent for several long seconds. Then he said the energy profiles were consistent with antimatter containment systems, not laboratory-scale experiments. Industrial-scale production and storage facilities spread across the entire solar system and hidden inside the geological structures of moons and planets where our standard surveillance would never think to scan. I asked how that was possible. Humans were supposed to be primitive. Our projections placed them centuries away from antimatter technology. Torek said our projections had been catastrophically wrong from the beginning. The humans had not spent 40 years sitting in passive silence. They had been intercepting Council communications, reverse engineering technological principles that had taken other species millennia to develop, and building an infrastructure of terrifying capability while maintaining a facade of exactly the primitiveness we expected to see. They had been hiding in plain sight, playing the role we had assigned them while constructing something monstrous beneath our feet. I took everything Torek had given me directly to the Council. I demanded an emergency closed session. I laid out every data point, every sensor reading, every intelligence intercept. I argued that the blockade needed to be dissolved immediately, that genuine diplomatic negotiations needed to begin that day, and that every hour we continued provoking this species was an hour we were gambling with catastrophe. The Draythari delegation called the intelligence fabricated. Kale Vorath accused me of being a human sympathizer, a coward, and a traitor to the Galactic Order. The Compact representatives questioned my mental fitness for duty. My motion for de-escalation was voted down by the same comfortable majority that had approved every other disastrous decision in this entire saga. And then the Council did what the Council always does when confronted with something it does not understand. It escalated. Resolution 7702 authorized the deployment of a compliance fleet to the Sol system, 40 warships, drawn from the combined navies of the Draythari hegemony and the Compact, armed with enough firepower to shatter continents. Their orders were to enter the Sol system, approach Earth, and force the human governments to accept integration by any means necessary. 4 words: by any means necessary. 4 words that have ignited more wars than any battle cry in the history of civilization. I filed my formal objection. I made certain it was entered into the permanent record with my name, my title, and the date, so that when historians eventually sifted through the wreckage of what was about to happen, they would find at least one voice that had tried to prevent it, not to save my reputation, to prove that someone tried. The fleet launched 3 days later. I watched from the observation gallery as 40 warships accelerated out of Council space toward the Sol system. 40 points of light moving in perfect formation, carrying enough destructive power to end civilizations, pointed at a small blue planet that had committed no crime greater than refusing to answer its messages. Each ship was a masterpiece of military engineering. Draythari dreadnoughts with hulls that could withstand sustained nuclear bombardment. Compact interceptors designed for speed and precision strikes. Support vessels carrying enough supplies to sustain a military occupation for years. The fleet represented the concentrated military might of the 2 most powerful factions in the galaxy, assembled for the purpose of forcing a single uncontacted species to submit to a treaty they had never asked for and never wanted. The fleet's departure was broadcast live on the Council's public information network. It was meant to be a demonstration of resolve, a message to every species in the galaxy that defiance of the Council was not tolerated. Delegates watched from the gallery and the chamber, and many of them applauded as the last ship cleared the departure perimeter. I did not applaud. I stood by the window and watched those points of light shrink into the distance, and I thought about the intelligence reports sitting on my desk, the energy readings from Europa, the encrypted data streams on Earth's networks, the quiet, methodical retooling of an entire civilization's industrial base. I thought about a species that had spent its entire existence surviving things that should have destroyed it, and I wondered what the Council expected to find when it arrived at their doorstep with weapons drawn. I watched them go, and I felt something I had not experienced in centuries of political life. A dread so deep it felt like falling. Not for the humans, for us. For what we were about to discover about the species we had just cornered. The compliance fleet crossed into the Sol system on what humans would call a Tuesday morning. I know that because I was listening to their communications when it happened, monitoring the ordinary sounds of a civilization going about its day. Weather forecasts, traffic reports, school announcements, a radio program where 2 hosts argued cheerfully about a sporting event, the completely mundane soundtrack of 8 billion people who knew that a war fleet was approaching their world and had chosen to eat breakfast anyway. I was in the council chamber with 3,000 delegates. The tactical display filled the center of the room, a massive holographic projection showing the Sol system in real time. Our 40 warships slid past Neptune's orbit in a combat formation designed to project overwhelming force. Every weapon system was armed, every defensive shield was raised. The fleet moved as a single coordinated organism, each ship holding its position with mechanical precision. The energy in the chamber was electric. Delegates who had spent months arguing about the human problem were now united in the visceral thrill of watching power being projected across the stars. The Draythari delegation occupied the prime seats at the chamber's center, and Kale Vorith sat among them with the expression of a man watching the final act of a play he had written himself. The fleet commander was Admiral Draven Koss, a Draythari career officer who had spent his entire professional life following orders and had never once been required to exercise original thought. He was chosen specifically because he would do exactly what he was told without hesitation or creativity. As the fleet crossed Neptune's orbit, he broadcast the compliance declaration on every available frequency. The message was a formal demand for immediate and unconditional submission, delivered in the 6 most common galactic languages. It gave Earth 12 standard hours to respond with a formal acceptance of Council authority. The transmission went out. The fleet continued its advance. The chamber waited. Minutes passed. 10, 20, 30. The delegates began to shift in their seats. Some whispered to each other. A few checked their personal communication devices. The silence from Earth felt different now. Not passive, not empty. It felt like the silence inside a locked room where you have just heard something move. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like my own was repeating a single phrase. I told you all. For 20 years I told you this was a mistake, and now here we sit, watching the consequences unfold in real time, and there is nothing any of us can do to stop what happens next. The fleet passed the orbit of Neptune and continued inward. The Sol system was eerily quiet. Our sensors registered no military activity anywhere in the system, no ships, no weapons platforms, no orbital defenses. Earth looked exactly as naked and vulnerable as it had always looked. Just a blue planet orbiting a yellow star, without a single visible defense to protect it. Admiral Koss took this as confirmation that his approach was correct. He broadcast a second message, this one shorter and more aggressive than the first, reminding Earth that the Council's patience was not infinite and that compliance was in humanity's best interest. The void answered with static. And then, for the first time in 40 years, Earth spoke. The transmission bypassed every standard communication channel the fleet was monitoring. It appeared directly on the flagship's bridge command console, an encrypted terminal that used Draythari military protocols so classified that only 7 individuals in the entire hegemony were authorized to access them. The signal should have been impossible for anyone outside Draythari High Command to generate. It appeared anyway. A single voice, female, calm in the way that deep water is calm, with all the force hidden beneath the surface. Speaking in flawless Draythari, the restricted diplomatic dialect taught only in the most secure military academies of the hegemony. Not an approximation, not a translation. Perfect. Every syllable precise, every tonal inflection authentic. Whoever was speaking had not merely learned the language, they had mastered it so thoroughly that our linguistic analysis systems initially identified the speaker as a native Draythari. The message was 5 sentences long. Translated into common galactic standard, it said, "You were not invited. Your presence in this system constitutes a violation of the sovereign territory of the human species. You have 30 minutes to reverse course and withdraw beyond the outer perimeter. This is not a negotiation. You have 30 minutes. The council chamber went silent. Not the productive silence of 3,000 minds working through a complex problem. The empty, ringing silence of shock. 3,000 delegates from 312 species stared at the tactical display. And for the first time in my entire career, nobody had a single word to say. I watched Kale Vorith's face. I watched the satisfaction drain out of it, like water from a cracked vessel. In its place came something I had never seen on a Draythari face. Not anger, not confusion, fear. because the implications of what had just happened were seismic. Humans should not know the Drethari diplomatic dialect. It was not broadcast publicly. It was not documented in any database outside of Drethari military secure servers. It was taught through direct instruction in facilities whose locations were classified. For a human to speak it with native fluency meant that humanity had not merely been listening to galactic communications for 40 years. They had been actively penetrating the most secure information systems in the galaxy. If they had broken Drethari military encryption, the most sophisticated security architecture any species had ever developed, then what else had they broken? What else did they know? How deep had they gone? Those questions hung in the air like smoke, but Admiral Koss was not a man built for nuance. He was a soldier. Soldiers respond to uncertainty with force, because force is the only language they have been trained to speak. He dismissed the transmission as a psychological warfare tactic, ordered his communications team to trace the signal origin, and commanded the fleet to maintain course and speed. The fleet pushed deeper, past the orbit of Uranus, past the scattered ice of the outer system, toward Saturn and the inner worlds beyond. The 30-minute deadline counted down on every display in the council chamber, while 3,000 delegates watched, and Admiral Koss stood on his bridge with his arms crossed, daring Earth to act. At the 29-minute mark, the first impossible thing happened. Every single trade exclusion perimeter station, all 412 of them, went dark at the same instant, not destroyed. There was no weapons fire, no energy discharge, no debris field. They simply stopped functioning. Their power systems shut down. Their communication arrays went silent. Their targeting systems deactivated. In the space of a single heartbeat, the blockade that had taken 6 days to deploy and 3 months to maintain ceased to exist. Admiral Koss demanded an explanation. His technical staff reported that the stations had not malfunctioned. Their command codes had been externally overridden. Someone had accessed the Council's encrypted military network and issued a simultaneous shutdown command to every station in the perimeter. The encryption on those command codes was supposed to be unbreakable. The humans had broken it anyway. The chamber erupted into noise. Delegates shouted over each other. Accusations flew between factions. Kale Voreth was screaming at the Ur Compact representatives, demanding to know how their security had been breached. Nobody was listening to anybody. The noise was the sound of an institution discovering, in real time, that it was not as powerful as it had believed. But the blockade was only the overture. The fleet's long-range sensors began registering new contacts. First a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. Contacts emerging from the frozen ocean of Europa. Contacts rising from the methane seas of Titan. Contacts detaching from asteroids in the belt. Contacts lifting from beneath the rusted surface of Mars. Ships, human ships, appearing from places where our surveillance had detected nothing, because we had never imagined that a pre-integration species could build warships inside the geological structures of other worlds. They had not been building on Earth. Earth was the decoy, the homeworld that every sensor was pointed at, the obvious target that kept all eyes focused in one direction, while the real construction happened everywhere else. Inside moons, beneath frozen oceans, buried in asteroid cores, hidden in the vast empty spaces where no one looked, because no one believed there was anything to find. I stared at the tactical display as the contact count climbed past 500, past 600, past 700. The human ships were not elegant. Council warships were designed to inspire fear and admiration in equal measure, with sweeping hulls and gleaming surfaces that caught starlight like blades. The human vessels were the opposite. They were angular, thick-skinned, covered in heavy plating that looked like it had been hammered into shape by hand. They had no viewports, no decorative elements, no insignia, except small identification codes stenciled on their hulls in a font designed for function, not beauty. They were tools, machines built for one specific purpose, by a species that had spent 4 decades preparing for a fight they hoped would never come. 847 human warships arranged themselves between the Council fleet and Earth. They formed a wall, not a formation, not a tactical pattern, a wall. A physical barrier of iron and intent that said, in the most primal language any species could understand, "You will not pass." The fleet analysts on the flagship began transmitting technical assessments back to the council chamber. In real time, their reports made the chamber go cold. The human ships were not primitive copies of council designs. They were something entirely new. The hull plating was composed of a material our sensors could not fully identify. Some kind of composite alloy that appeared to absorb rather than deflect sensor beams. Their power signatures were enormous, far larger than ships of that size should have been able to generate, suggesting energy systems based on principles our own scientists had not yet developed. And their weapon systems, still powered down, still dormant, registered on our threat assessment displays as unknown classification, which was the system's way of saying it could not find anything in its database that matched what it was looking at. One analyst, a Siluri physicist attached to the fleet observation team, sent a personal message to a colleague back in council space. The message was intercepted by our own intelligence division and later entered into the record. It said, "They did not copy our technology. They looked at our technology, understood the principles behind it, and then built something better. We have been arming them with our own transmissions for 40 years. 40 council warships against 847 human ones. The tactical computer recalculated engagement probabilities and displayed a number so lopsided that several delegates physically recoiled from the display. Admiral Koss, for the first time in his career, did the smart thing. He ordered a full stop. The compliance fleet hung motionless in the void between Saturn and Jupiter, surrounded on three sides by a force that outnumbered it 20-1, and waited for someone to tell it what to do. His request for new orders hit the council chamber like a bomb. The Draythari demanded an immediate attack. The Ewer Compact called for withdrawal. A dozen smaller species began drafting emergency resolutions. Kale Voreth stood at his podium and screamed until his voice cracked, insisting the human fleet was a bluff, that those ships were empty shells, that humanity could not possibly have built a functional navy without the council detecting it. I said nothing. I sat at my station and watched those 847 brutal, ugly, purpose-built warships, holding their positions with the patience of something that has waited 40 years for this moment. And I understood at last what the silence had meant. For 40 years, we had watched Earth. And for 40 years, Earth had watched us back, studied our tactics, decoded our communications, mapped our weaknesses, and found us so predictable that they had been able to plan for this exact scenario decades in advance. The standoff lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of political chaos in the council chamber, while the fleets hung motionless in the dark and the universe held its breath. I spent those 9 hours watching the human fleet on the tactical display, looking for any sign of aggression, any indication that their patience was running thin. There was none. The 847 ships maintained their positions with a precision that our fleet analysts found deeply unsettling. Not a single vessel drifted more than a few meters from its assigned coordinates. Not a single weapon system powered up. Not a single communication was broadcast. They were a wall of silence and iron, and their discipline was more terrifying than any threat could have been. At the 4-hour mark, something remarkable happened on the human side that our sensors barely detected. A small civilian shuttle launched from Earth's surface and docked with one of the warships near the rear of the formation. It carried supplies, food, water, fresh uniforms. The humans were rotating crew members and providing meals to their fleet in the middle of a military standoff. They were not treating this as a crisis. They were treating it as a shift change, as if standing between 40 alien warships and their home planet was simply another day at work that required regular breaks and proper nutrition. That single detail frightened me more than the fleet itself. A species that panics under pressure makes mistakes you can exploit. A species that packs lunch for a standoff with a galactic superpower is a species that has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for you to catch up. During those 9 hours, 3 things happened that changed the shape of galactic civilization forever. The first was a second transmission from Earth. This one arrived openly, broadcast on the Council's own diplomatic frequency so every delegate could hear it. A male voice. Older, measured, speaking in flawless common galactic standard. He identified himself as Director Elliot Marsh, of Earth's Interstellar Security Division, an organization that apparently had existed for over 3 decades without the Council's knowledge. He said that Earth was willing to receive a single diplomatic vessel from the Council fleet. One ship, unarmed, no escort. He said Earth wished to discuss terms. Not terms of surrender, terms of conversation. The second event was the fracturing of the Drathari coalition. 17 species that had voted for Resolution 7702 formally withdrew their support within 4 hours of seeing the human fleet. They filed motions to recall the compliance fleet, dissolve the blockade authorization, and open immediate diplomatic channels. Kale Vorath tried to block every motion. For the first time in decades, he did not have the votes. The third event was private. A message appeared on my personal console, encrypted with my own diplomatic cipher, a code that only I and the Council's Central Security Office were supposed to possess. The message said, "Counselor Serene, you argued for patience when no one would listen. You submitted reports warning against exactly what is happening now. We read every one of them. We would very much like to speak with you." It was signed by Dr. Claire Ashton, Ambassador Plenipotentiary of Earth to the Galactic Council. The title, according to the metadata, had been created 38 years ago. 2 years after Earth decoded our first transmission, they had appointed a fully credentialed ambassador to a council they had never officially acknowledged. They had staffed an entire diplomatic office. They had trained negotiators in our languages and protocols. They had prepared for this day the way a civilization prepares for a storm it can see approaching from the horizon. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I authorized the diplomatic shuttle. Admiral Koss protested. The Drathari command structure protested. The Council, running on adrenaline and the first faint stirrings of wisdom, overruled them all. A single unarmed shuttle detached from the flagship and moved slowly toward the human formation. The wall of ships parted. A narrow corridor opened, barely wider than the shuttle itself, and closed behind it like a door shutting. The shuttle docked with a vessel at the center of the formation, a ship marginally larger than the others, distinguished only by a small blue circle painted on its hull. 20 minutes later, the shuttle returned. The airlock cycled open, and Dr. Claire Ashton stepped onto a Drathari warship. The footage was broadcast live to the council chamber. I watched from my station as 3,000 delegates went absolutely still. Dr. Ashton was not what anyone expected. She was in her late 50s, short gray hair, reading glasses hanging from a thin chain around her neck. She wore a dark blue civilian suit with no insignia, no medals, no symbols of military authority. She carried a single data pad. She looked like a university professor arriving to deliver a guest lecture, not like a representative of a species that had just revealed the most powerful hidden military force the galaxy had ever seen. She was escorted to the flagship's communication suite and connected via live feed to the full council chamber. She stood alone in front of the camera, one human being facing 3,000 alien delegates who represented the accumulated political and military power of 10,000 years of galactic governance. She adjusted her glasses, she looked directly into the camera, and she smiled. Not the nervous smile of someone out of their depth, not the diplomatic smile of carefully managed emotion, the smile of a woman who had spent 38 years preparing for this exact moment and was finally getting to do what she had been put on this world to do. She said, "Good morning. My name is Claire Ashton. I am the ambassador of Earth to the Galactic Council, and I have been waiting a very long time to speak with you. I apologize for the delay. We wanted to make sure we had something worth saying." Then she spoke for 47 minutes without notes, without hesitation, without a single waver in her voice. And what she said took the Galactic Council apart more surgically than any fleet could have managed. She explained that Earth had decoded the Council's first transmission within 72 hours. Within a month, a unified global task force was analyzing every byte of information it contained. Within a year, that task force had begun intercepting the Council's internal communications, diplomatic traffic, military channels, intelligence networks, economic data flows, private correspondence between heads of state. For 39 years, she said, Earth had been reading every message the galaxy sent to itself. She described what they had found. Not a community of civilizations cooperating for mutual benefit. A protection racket, dressed in diplomatic language. The Accord of Mutual Compliance was not a partnership agreement. It was a document of surrender. Species that signed it gave up independent control of their military forces. They ceded authority over their trade policies. They submitted their scientific research to council review boards that decided which technologies a species was allowed to develop and which were classified as restricted. Integration did not mean joining a galactic community. It meant becoming a managed territory of an empire that called itself a council to avoid admitting what it was. She named species that had been coerced into signing. She cited specific diplomatic communications where council officials openly discussed forcing compliance through economic strangulation. She described backroom deals between the Draythari and the Ur Compact to divide the resources of newly integrated worlds before those worlds had even been formally contacted. She talked about the Minari, a peaceful aquatic species that had been told their oceans would be drained if they did not accept integration terms within 30 days. She mentioned the Varrock, whose entire cultural archive had been threatened with destruction unless their government signed the accord. She described the Tesserae, a species of brilliant engineers who had been specifically targeted because the Draythari wanted access to their shipbuilding capabilities, and whose refusal had resulted in a complete communications blackout that lasted until their government capitulated. Each name landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. Delegates from those species stirred in their seats. Some leaned forward, some put their heads in their hands. The Minari ambassador was openly weeping, a rare display of emotion from a species that prided itself on composure. These were truths that had been buried for centuries, truths that the victims themselves had been conditioned to deny, and hearing them spoken aloud by a human who had no reason to lie was like watching a wound that had been sealed shut finally being cleaned. Then she said the word that turned the chamber into a firestorm: Kelvari. The Council's official account of the Kelvari integration described a peaceful transition of government. Dr. Ashton said the Draythari hegemony had bombarded 3 Kelvari population centers from orbit before the surviving government agreed to sign the accord. She provided the coordinates of the bombardment sites. She played intercepted Draythari military communications in which officers discussed acceptable civilian casualty thresholds. She displayed the names of Kelvari officials who had been eliminated during the so-called peaceful transition, 743 names. She read the first 50 aloud. The Kelvari delegate in the chamber, an elderly female named Presiding Minister Iola, sat motionless through the entire recitation. She had been 4 years old when the bombardment happened. She had been told her entire life that the transition was peaceful, that the accord had been accepted willingly, that the cities destroyed had been lost to natural disasters. Watching her face as Dr. Ashton read the truth was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Every certainty she had ever held about her own history was crumbling, and in its place was a grief so vast that even from across the chamber I could feel its weight. When Dr. Ashton finished the names, Iola stood. She did not speak. She turned to face the Draythari delegation and stared at them in silence for a full 30 seconds. Then she removed her Accord Compliance Medallion, the symbol that every integrated species was required to wear during council sessions, and placed it carefully on the floor in front of her seat. She sat down. She did not speak for the rest of the session, but her gesture was the loudest thing that happened in that chamber. Kale Voreth leaped from his seat. He screamed that she was lying, that the evidence was fabricated, that the council should terminate the feed and place Dr. Ashton under arrest immediately. His voice was shaking, not with anger, with the desperate energy of a man watching the foundation of his power crack beneath his feet. Dr. Ashton waited for him to exhaust himself. Then she looked directly at him through the camera, and she spoke in Draythari again. That flawless, impossible, perfectly accented Draythari, and she told him she knew about the pact. The military agreement signed 9 years earlier between the Draythari hegemony and the Ur Compact. A secret treaty known to only 4 individuals in the galaxy. A treaty that outlined the division of Sol system resources following Earth's forced integration. It assigned mining rights on Mars and the asteroid belt to the Draythari. It granted the Ur Compact exclusive access to Earth's biological diversity for genetic research purposes. It allocated Earth's human population as a managed labor resource, with quotas and production targets, and it included an amendment, added 6 months before the current crisis, that expanded the labor provisions to include human children over the age of 12. She recited the pact. every clause, every amendment, every signature. From memory, in the language of the species that had written it, standing alone on a warship surrounded by the fleet that was supposed to have conquered her world. The chamber did not erupt, it detonated. 3,000 delegates turned on each other with a ferocity that made every previous political session look like a polite disagreement. The Drathari and Ur delegations were physically separated by council security forces. 17 species filed motions for criminal investigation within the hour. My own people, the Siluri, formally withdrew from the Accord of Mutual Compliance before Dr. Ashton had finished her next sentence. She was not finished. When the chamber calmed enough for her voice to carry, she said the thing that no one had anticipated. She said Earth did not want war. Earth did not want vengeance. Earth wanted something the Council had never offered any species in 10,000 years. Friendship. Not integration. Not compliance. Not subjugation dressed in diplomatic language. A bilateral treaty. Equal partners. Sovereign nations choosing to cooperate because cooperation was better than coercion. She said Earth had technologies to share. Medical advances developed during 40 years of secret research that could eliminate diseases that had plagued galactic civilizations for centuries. Energy systems that could power worlds for millennia. Agricultural techniques that could feed populations currently starving under the Council's restrictive trade policies. She said the hidden fleet was not a weapon of conquest. It was a guarantee. A promise that no one would ever be able to force humanity to its knees. A shield, not a sword. She said Earth's hand was open. All the galaxy had to do was reach out and take it. Kael Vorath, stripped of allies, his secrets exposed to 3,000 witnesses, made his final move. He invoked the Drathari hegemony's military authority under the Accord and directly ordered Admiral Koss to open fire on the human fleet. His voice cracked as he gave the command. He was a man throwing himself off a cliff and hoping the fall would somehow save him. Dr. Ashton did not flinch. She looked at the camera and said, in that same measured voice, Admiral Koss made his decision 4 hours ago. Would you like to hear it from him? Koss appeared on the split feed. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. He said, in a voice emptied of everything except exhaustion and relief, that the compliance fleet was standing down. He said he would not fire on a species that had offered peace when it had every right and every capability to choose war instead. He said he was returning his ships to Council space. Kael Vorath screamed, a raw animal sound that echoed through the chamber and bounced off walls that had stood for 10,000 years. Security forces removed him. The tour delegation had already departed. The chamber was half empty and utterly, irreversibly changed. I sat at my station and looked at Dr. Ashton's face on the screen. She was not smiling now. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had been carrying a weight meant for an entire civilization across her own shoulders for 38 years, and had just, finally, at last, set it down. I sent her a message through my console. I said, "Thank you." She replied in less than a minute. She said, "Come visit us, counselor. Bring your appetite. We have a great deal to discuss." 6 months passed before I stood on the surface of Earth. I was part of the first official diplomatic delegation, 46 representatives from the species that had signed bilateral treaties with humanity in the weeks following the Sol standoff. We arrived at a spaceport the humans had constructed on the coast of a landmass they called West Africa. The facility was vast and obviously recent, still smelling of fresh construction materials, but it was already surrounded by the kind of organized chaos that I was beginning to understand was not a flaw of human civilization, but its natural operating state. I stepped off the transport vessel and stopped moving. I could not help it. Earth was overwhelming. The air hit me first, warm and dense, and carrying so many chemical signatures that my sensory organs could not process them all at once. Salt from the ocean, soil and growing plants, machine exhaust, and food. Dozens of distinct food preparations, all happening somewhere nearby, each one producing a different aromatic profile that tangled together into a single complex wave of sensation. The sky was a blue I had never encountered on any other world, not the thin, pale blue of atmospheres I had visited before. A deep, saturated, almost aggressive blue that seemed to press down from above with physical weight. Clouds moved through it in shapes that changed as I watched, and the local star poured golden light across everything with an intensity that made the entire landscape glow. Sound came next, humans everywhere, moving with a speed and energy that made our delegation look like we were standing still. Vehicles, machinery, voices in multiple languages overlapping into a continuous wall of noise that should have been chaotic, but somehow contained a rhythm, a pulse, as if the entire civilization was a single living organism with a heartbeat you could feel through the ground. A ground vehicle took our delegation to the nearby capital city. The streets were lined with humans who had come to watch the alien diplomats pass. Their expressions were extraordinary in their variety. Curiosity, excitement, suspicion, joy, fear, amusement. One small girl, no older than 5 or 6 by human development, broke free from her mother's hand and sprinted directly toward me. She grabbed the edge of my diplomatic robe and said something in a language I did not understand. Her face turned up toward me with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. Her mother caught up seconds later, apologizing profusely in common standard, while trying to pry the child's fingers from my clothing. The girl released me reluctantly and waved as she was carried away. I waved back. I had never made the gesture before, but it seemed like the right thing to do. The treaty negotiations took place in a conference facility that the humans had built specifically for this purpose. It was designed with remarkable attention to the biological needs of dozens of different species. Temperature zones, atmospheric adjustments, lighting spectrums calibrated for non-human visual ranges. They had done their research. They had done it thoroughly. Dr. Claire Ashton met us at the entrance. She looked different from the woman I had seen on the flagship feed. Lighter, as if the weight she had been carrying had not just been set down, but had evaporated entirely. She moved through the delegation, greeting each representative individually, grasping their hands in the human custom, and when she reached me, she held on for a moment longer than protocol required. She said, "Counselor Serene, I have read every speech you gave, every objection you filed, every report you submitted that no one listened to. You were right about us from the very beginning." I said, "I was not right enough. I did not stop the fleet." She said, "No one could have stopped the fleet. But you made sure the record showed that someone tried. You have no idea how much that mattered to us." Over the following weeks, I learned more about humanity than 4 decades of surveillance had ever revealed. I toured their cities and their research institutions. I visited a school where children were learning Siluri, my own language, as an elective course. A boy of about 10 years asked me what my favorite food was. I explained that my species does not consume food in the way humans do. He considered this with the deep seriousness that human children bring to problems they find genuinely interesting, and then asked if I would like to try chocolate anyway. I agreed. The substance was extraordinary, sweet and bitter and complex, in ways that my sensory organs had no framework for interpreting. I asked for a second piece. I toured military installations that the humans had finally declassified. They were exactly what our intelligence had feared. Enormous. Technologically sophisticated decades beyond our projections. Housing research programs that were producing innovations our own scientists could not yet replicate, but the officers who guided us through these facilities did not carry themselves with pride. They carried themselves with relief. They told me the secrecy had been the hardest part of the entire operation. Lying to their own populations about where the resources were going, watching their civilian sectors struggle with problems that the hidden technology could have solved, making the choice, every single day for 40 years, that the survival of the species was more important than the comfort of a generation. One facility, buried deep inside a mountain range the humans called the Andes, had been the primary coordination center for the entire Hidden Fleet program. The walls were lined with display screens, showing production schedules, resource allocations, and construction timelines for every ship, every weapon system, every piece of technology that had been built in secret over 4 decades. A human engineer named Peter Langford walked me through the facility and told me that at its peak, over 200,000 people had been directly involved in the project. 200,000 humans who had signed secrecy agreements, who had moved to remote locations and cut ties with their families and friends, who had dedicated their lives to building a defense that they prayed would never be tested. He showed me a wall in one of the deeper corridors. It was covered with photographs of people who had worked on the project and died before the Seoul standoff, before they could ever know whether their sacrifice had mattered. There were hundreds of photographs. Some showed young faces, some showed old ones. All of them showed people who had given up normal lives so that their species could survive. I stood in front of that wall for a long time. Peter stood beside me in silence. Eventually, I asked him how humans endured that kind of burden. He said they had a word for it. He said they called it duty. One officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Grace Harlan, told me she had joined the program at 18. She said she had spent her entire adult life working on ships she was not allowed to tell her family about, developing technologies she could not publish, living a double life for the sake of a defense strategy she had to take on faith would never actually be needed. She said when the compliance fleet appeared on their sensors, when the moment they had all been preparing for finally arrived, she did not feel triumph. She felt sadness, because it meant the galaxy was exactly as hostile as they had feared, and the decades of secrecy and sacrifice had been necessary after all. I asked her if she resented the Council for forcing her species into that position. She thought about it for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions that I was only beginning to learn how to read on human features. Then she said she did not have time for resentment. There was too much building to do now. She said resentment was a luxury for species that had already secured their future, and humanity was not there yet. She said the treaties were a beginning, not an ending, and that the real work of proving to the galaxy that cooperation was better than coercion would take decades, maybe centuries, but she said humans were good at long projects. They had just finished one that took 40 years, and they were ready to start the next. I found her optimism almost painful to witness. After everything the galaxy had done to her species, after the blockade and the threats and the secret plan to enslave her people, she was still looking forward, still planning, still believing that the universe could be better than it had shown itself to be. I asked her where that faith came from. She said it came from the same place the hidden fleet came from. Fear. She said humans were so afraid of a dark future that they would work themselves to exhaustion building a brighter one. She said fear and hope were not opposites for her species. They were the same engine, spinning in different directions. One evening, toward the end of my visit, Dr. Ashton invited me to her residence for dinner. She lived in a modest home near the coast, crammed with books and papers, and the kind of comfortable clutter that accumulates around a person who has been too busy saving the world to organize their shelves. She cooked the meal herself: rice, vegetables, a protein called fish that came from the ocean I could see from her windows. I could not eat most of it, but I sampled everything, and she seemed genuinely pleased by the attempt. We sat on her balcony as the sun went down. The ocean stretched to the horizon, and the sky turned colors I did not have names for. Oranges that deepened into reds, that dissolved into purples, that finally surrendered to the deep blue of night. On my homeworld, sunsets are a muted affair, a gradual dimming that carries no particular beauty. Earth's sun went down like a performance, like the planet itself was putting on a show for anyone willing to watch. She drank something she called tea. I processed atmospheric nutrients and watched the light change, and tried to understand how a species that lived on a world this beautiful could have spent so much of its history in conflict. She seemed to read my thoughts. She said that beauty and violence had always lived side by side on Earth. She said humans loved their world fiercely and had spent centuries simultaneously trying to protect it and accidentally destroying it. She said that contradiction was not a flaw in human nature, but the central feature of it, the tension between what they were and what they wanted to be, and that the entire Hidden Fleet project had been an expression of that same tension. A species that wanted peace so badly that it spent 40 years building the largest secret military force in galactic history to guarantee it. Then she told me the truth, that no formal speech or treaty session would ever contain. Earth had been terrified, every moment, every day, for 40 years. The silence was not a position of strength. It was the only defense available to a species that had looked at the galaxy and understood, with perfect clarity, that they were surrounded by civilizations with faster ships, bigger weapons, deeper resources, and thousands of years of technological advantage. They could not fight. They could not run. The only thing they could do was disappear, go quiet, become invisible. and use every second the silence bought them to build something that might, if they were lucky, and smart, and relentless, be enough to survive first contact with a galaxy that had never once in its history treated a new species with genuine kindness. Every scientist who worked on the hidden fleet knew that discovery meant destruction. Every military officer who managed the construction knew the odds were against them. Every political leader who funded the program knew they were making a bet with the lives of 8 billion people as the stake. She told me the blockade came 5 years before the fleet was ready. When Resolution 7702 was transmitted and the compliance fleet was deployed, Earth's defense planners calculated their probability of surviving a full engagement at 60%. Not 90. Not 80. 60. Those were the odds behind the calm voice that delivered the 30-minute ultimatum. Those were the odds behind the wall of 847 ships, a coin flip dressed up as overwhelming force. I asked her the question I had been carrying since the standoff. I asked what would have happened if Admiral Koss had opened fire. She went quiet for a long time. The ocean moved in the darkness below us, vast and patient, and somewhere along the coast, a bird I could not identify sang a 3-note song that repeated itself endlessly, each repetition slightly different from the last. She said, "We had a plan for that too. You would not have liked it." I waited. She did not elaborate. I did not ask again. Some truths are better left unspoken, and the look in her eyes told me that the plan she was not describing was something she had spent 38 years hoping she would never have to use. We sat together in silence after that, watching the stars appear one by one above the ocean. Among them, invisible to the naked eye, were the ships that had nearly started a galactic war, and the empty stations of a blockade that no longer existed. Somewhere out there, the Council was still convening emergency sessions, still arguing about what to do about the human problem. But sitting on that balcony, drinking tea with a woman who had stared down the galaxy and won, the Council felt very far away and very small. I returned to the Council building 3 weeks later. The chamber was half empty. 97 species had formally withdrawn from the Accord of Mutual Compliance. The Draythari hegemony was under investigation by a coalition of former allies. Kale Vorath had been removed from his post and was awaiting trial for his role in the Kelvari bombardment and the secret Sol System Pact. The Ur Compact had splintered into 3 rival factions, each blaming the others for the exposure of the agreement that had brought their entire coalition to ruin. 46 species had signed bilateral treaties with Earth. 46 species that were now trading freely, sharing technology, exchanging cultural knowledge, building something new. Not a council, not an empire. Something smaller, messier, and more honest. A network of relationships, built on the radical premise that cooperation should be voluntary, and that every species deserves the dignity of choosing its own path. It was inefficient, it was chaotic, it was, in a word, human, and it was working. New trade routes opened between species that had never been allowed to deal directly with each other under the old system. The Minari and the Tessari, species that had been kept apart by Council trade restrictions for centuries, discovered they had complementary economies and established a partnership that was already generating more prosperity than either had experienced under the Accord. Medical technologies that Earth had developed in secret began flowing outward, treating diseases that the Council's restricted research policies had prevented anyone else from curing. A neurological condition that had afflicted the Varrock for generations was eliminated within weeks of human medical teams arriving on their homeworld. The Varrock ambassador sent a personal message to Dr. Ashton that simply said, "Our children will know your name forever." Agricultural methods designed for human worlds were adapted for alien biospheres, and 3 species that had been experiencing chronic food shortages under the Council's trade quotas reported full self-sufficiency within months. For the first time in their history, they were feeding their own people, without having to beg the Draythari for permission to import grain. The political landscape shifted in ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. 12 species formally requested human diplomatic advisors to help restructure their internal governance. 7 species asked for assistance in developing their own independent defense capabilities, determined never to be as vulnerable as they had been under the Accord. And in a development that I found both remarkable and deeply moving, 23 species that had never had any contact with each other began establishing direct diplomatic relationships, inspired by the model Earth had demonstrated. The galaxy, for the first time in 10,000 years, was beginning to organize itself from the bottom up, rather than the top down. It was not perfect. Nothing built by living beings ever is. There were disputes, misunderstandings, cultural collisions that required patient negotiation. Two species nearly severed their treaties over a trade disagreement before Earth's diplomats, drawing on their civilization's long and painful experience with exactly this kind of conflict, helped mediate a resolution. I am writing this account from my office in the council building. The building is quieter than it used to be. The hallways that once echoed with the footsteps of 3,000 delegates now carry the lighter tread of a few hundred. The grand chamber is far too large for the number of species that still attend sessions. Someone proposed relocating to a smaller room. The proposal was voted down. We keep the large chamber because the empty seats serve as a reminder of what happens when an institution confuses power with authority and obedience with loyalty. On my desk, there is a small package that arrived this morning from Earth. It is from the boy at the school. His name is George, and he has been writing to me every week for 4 months. His letters are filled with questions about my homeworld, my species, my daily life. He wants to know my favorite color. He wants to know if I have pets. He wants to know what the stars look like from my planet. He included a drawing of what he thinks I look like. The proportions are entirely wrong, but he got my eyes right, and he drew a smile on my face that I do not think my species is physically capable of producing, but that I appreciated nonetheless. I keep every one of his letters. I keep them in a folder on the corner of my desk, and when the political sessions grow long, and the maneuvering grows tedious, and I begin to wonder whether any of this matters, I open the folder and read the most recent one. His latest letter asks if I will come back to visit next year. He says his class is performing a play, and they need someone to play the role of the alien ambassador. He says I would be perfect because I would not even need a costume. I have already written back to say yes. The galaxy is changing, the old structures are crumbling, and what will replace them is not yet clear. There will be difficult days ahead. Species that profited from the old system will resist the new one. There will be setbacks and betrayals and moments when the entire fragile experiment seems on the verge of collapse. But there is also this. A boy named George, who writes letters to an alien 400 light-years away because he believes the distance between stars is not a barrier, but an invitation. A woman named Claire Ashton, who waited 38 years for the chance to offer friendship instead of firing a weapon. A species that spent 4 decades in terrified silence, building and preparing and sacrificing, and when they finally opened their mouths, chose to speak words of peace to a galaxy that had given them every reason to choose war. I think about that choice constantly. I think about what it must have cost them. They had the fleet, they had the technology. They had 40 years of righteous anger at a galaxy that had ignored them, blockaded them, threatened them, and planned to enslave their children. They could have used Dr. Ashton's moment in front of the council to issue demands, to establish dominance, to become the new hegemony replacing the old one. Their military strength would have made it possible. Their intelligence advantage would have made it easy. They could have become exactly the kind of power the Draythari had always been, and most of the galaxy would have accepted it, because most of the galaxy had spent 10,000 years accepting that the strongest species makes the rules. Instead, they offered friendship. They shared their technology freely. They asked for nothing in return except the right to be treated as equals. They took the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever seen and used it not as a weapon but as a shield, protecting not just themselves but any species that wanted to stand beside them. That is the thing about humans that the Council never understood. That is the thing that I, despite all my study and all my reports and all my years of arguing on their behalf, did not fully grasp until I sat on a balcony, overlooking an alien ocean, and watched a woman who had carried the weight of first contact on her shoulders for nearly 4 decades, drink tea, and talk about being afraid. They are afraid. They have always been afraid. Fear is woven into every layer of their civilization, every institution, every cultural memory. But they do not let fear make them cruel. They let it make them careful. They let it make them prepared. And when the moment comes, when the fear is justified and the threat is real, and every instinct is screaming at them to strike first and ask questions later. They take a breath, and they extend their hand, and they say, "We would rather be friends." That is not weakness. That is the most extraordinary act of courage I have ever witnessed in 4 centuries of life. Earth taught us something the Galactic Council had forgotten across 10,000 years of empire, something so simple that it embarrasses me to realize how long it took 312 species to learn it. The ones who shout the loudest, who pound the table and brandish their weapons and demand compliance, are rarely the ones you should fear. The quiet ones. The ones who say nothing while they watch and learn and prepare. The ones who choose their moment, with the patience of a species that has survived everything its own world could throw at it. Those are the ones who change the shape of the galaxy. It is the quiet ones. It has always been the quiet ones. And when they finally speak, you had better be ready to listen.